The neighborhood sold itself as peaceful, orderly, and prestigious. But beneath the trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes lived a constant, unspoken tension. Every lawn looked the same, every fence followed the same height, and every house seemed frozen in time. The Homeowners Association didn't just manage the community, it controlled it. The rules were thick, the fines were fast, and the fear was subtle but effective. People here didn't decorate for joy. They decorated for compliance. When I moved in, I noticed how carefully everyone behaved. Lawns were cut with military precision. Trash bins vanished minutes after pickup. Porch furniture matched approved color palettes. Neighbors waved, but their eyes lingered too long, scanning for imperfections. This was a place where standing out even slightly was treated like a crime. I spent my first few months observing. I read the HOA bylaws cover to cover. I studied enforcement procedures, exemption clauses, and timelines. I learned which rules were absolute and which were vague enough to be abuse-earning, and who inexperienced with HOAs had taught me one thing very clearly. Most associations relied on ignorance and intimidation, not actual authority. And this one was no different. That's when I decided to decorate my lawn. It wasn't reckless or provocative. No political messages, no offensive imagery, no noise. Just seasonal decorations, arranged neatly, professionally installed, and entirely within the HOA's own written guidelines. Temporary displays were allowed. Decorative items were permitted. Height, spacing, and duration all complied exactly as written. I made sure of it. The decorations went up on a quiet Saturday morning. By the afternoon, I could feel the shift in the air. Cars slowed as they passed. Curtains moved. People stared just a little too long. What should have been a harmless seasonal display, immediate me, the most interesting thing in the neighborhood. And then there was Karen. She lived 3 houses down and had unofficially appointed herself the neighborhood's moral authority. She walked daily, phone always in hand, posture rigid, expression permanently dissatisfied. She never introduced herself, never welcomed me, never smiled. Her attention wasn't friendly. Curiosity was surveillance. That afternoon, she stopped, directly in front of my lawn. She didn't touch anything. She didn't smile. She didn't leave quickly. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes scanning every inch of the decorations like an inspector hunting for a defect. Her phone lifted slightly, just enough to capture photos under the guise of checking messages. I knew exactly what was coming. By Sunday, the whispers had started. Neighbors spoke in lowered voices while walking their dogs. Some glanced at my lawn, and then quickly looked away, as if association alone might put them at risk. Karen made multiple passes that day, each slower than the last. By Monday morning, the letter arrived. A formal HOA violation notice, printed on heavy paper and stamped with authority. It claimed my lawn decorations were unauthorized, disruptive, and in violation of community standards. It demanded immediate removal and threatened escalating fines if I failed to comply within 72 hours. It was confident, aggressive, final, and completely wrong. The notice didn't cite specific sections. It didn't include photos. It misstated the nature of the decorations. Even the compliance deadline violated the HOA's own enforcement procedures. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. Karen had called the HOA, and the HOA had acted without thinking. Most homeowners would panic. They would remove the decorations immediately, apologize, and quietly absorb the humiliation. That's what the HOA expected. That's what Karen expected. Instead, I smiled. I reread the notice slowly, marking every error. I pulled out the bylaws, highlighting the exact clauses that permitted what I had done. I reviewed state laws governing HOAs, selective enforcement, and due process. I gathered timestamps, installation receipts, and photos documenting full compliance. Then I waited. Karen watched from her window. From the sidewalk, from behind, thin smiles exchanged with neighbors. She expected movement boxers being packed, decorations coming down, submission. When nothing changed, her frustration became visible. Her walks became more frequent. Her stares lingered longer. She didn't realize that every extra photo she took, every extra report she filed, was digging her deeper into a hole she didn't know existed. I responded to the HOA formally, calmly, and in writing. I requested documentation. I requested clarification. I requested records of similar enforcement actions. I followed their procedures exactly, knowing full well that they wouldn't. Because HOAs don't fear rule-breakers. Action. Fear people who understand the rules better than they do. The decorations stayed up. The neighborhood grew tense. Then somewhere, between Karen's certainty and the HOA's overconfidence, a quiet realization began to form. This wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. What Karen believed was a simple complaint had just triggered something far bigger. She had called the HOA on my lawn decorations, and she had no idea. She had just declared war on the HOA's worst nightmare. The response from the HOA did not come quickly, and that delay revealed more than any letter ever could. Associations that are confident in their authority move fast. They are fined first, explain later, and rely on fear to maintain compliance. This time, the silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, because my response had disrupted the usual script. Behind the scenes, confusion spread. The board members were not accustomed to homeowners who quoted bylaws instead of begging for mercy. They were used to quick victories, not resistance backed by documentation. My request for records, enforcement histories, and written justification forced them into unfamiliar territory, one where their authority had to be proven instead of assumed. When the second notice finally arrived, it carried a different tone. The language was harsher, more legalistic, and deliberately intimidating. It warned of fines, liens, and further action. The formatting was more official. The threats were more explicit. It was the HOA's attempt to reassert dominance after realizing their first move hadn't worked, but the mistakes are still there. The notice cited incorrect time. It referenced vague community standards rather than specific bylaws. It ignored the exemptions I had already highlighted. Most telling of all, it failed to acknowledge my formal response entirely. The HOA had chosen to double down, rather than admit error. Karen saw the second notice as validation. Her presence in the neighborhood became more aggressive. She lingered openly now, no longer pretending to hide her surveillance. She walked past my property multiple times a day, phone visible, posture rigid, expression hardened. Her confidence returned, fueled by the belief that the HOA was firmly on her side. She didn't notice the small changes happening around her. Other neighbors began watching more closely. They noticed that the decorations remained untouched despite the threats. They noticed the absence of fines posted publicly. They noticed how carefully the HOA seemed to be moving, as if afraid of its own shadow. Quiet questions began circulating. Some neighbors approached me discreetly, not to confront, but to observe. They had received notices before, and fines they paid immediately without question. They had removed plants, repainted doors, replaced mailboxes, all because the HOA told them to. Now they were seeing someone push back and survive. I encouraged them to read the bylaws. That single act did more damage to the HOA's authority than any complaint ever could. Meanwhile, I escalated properly. I responded to the second notice with a detailed written rebuttal. I cited the exact bylaw section. I attached photographic evidence. I requested a formal hearing as guaranteed in the governing documents. I copied the property management company and the HOA's legal counsel, ensuring that the matter could no longer be handled casually or emotionally. This forced the HOA into a corner they could no longer rely on. Karen's outrage to justify enforcement. Everything now had to be documented, justified, and defensible. Every step they took would be scrutinized, not just by me, but potentially by attorneys, auditors, and regulators. The property management company shifted the tone immediately. Emails became slower, more cautious. Language softened. Phrases like, as per our understanding and pending review, replaced confident assertions. The management company had seen this before. They knew exactly where this was headed. The HOA board, however, was less prepared. The emergency meetings were scheduled. Emails were sent late at night. Board members expressed concern about personal liability, selective enforcement, and past practices. The easy confidence they once carried was gone, replaced by uncertainty and frustration. Karen pushed harder. She filed additional complaints. She documented more violations. She contacted board members directly, demanding action. Her urgency only made the situation worse, drawing attention to patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Patterns like enforcement, focused on certain homes. Patterns like violations are ignored when committed by favorite residents. Patterns like Karen's name appear again and again as the origin of complaints. The HOA finally announced a formal hearing date. It was scheduled weeks out, far beyond their own stated enforcement timelines. That delay spoke volumes. They weren't preparing to discipline me. They were buying time to understand the mess they were in. During that time, the neighborhood changed. Conversations happened that had never happened before. Neighbors compared letters, notices, and fines. Stories emerged of intimidation, rushed deadlines, and unexplained penalties. The decorations on my lawn became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of possibility. Karen noticed the shift was too late. Her authority, once unquestioned, began to crumble. Neighbors stopped engaging with her complaints. Board members stopped responding to her messages. The more she pushed, the more isolated she became. By the time the hearing approached, the HOA was no longer dealing with one homeowner. and some decorations. They were dealing with a systemic problem. And the most dangerous thing for any HOA to face is not being a rule-breaker. It is a resident who exposes how poorly the rules have been applied. As the scheduled hearing drew closer, the board faced an impossible choice: enforce a violation they could not legally defend, or admit that Karen's complaint had opened the door to far more scrutiny than they could control. They chose neither, and that hesitation would soon cost them everything. The hearing never happened. No announcement, no explanation, no new date, just a quiet cancellation buried in a vague email that avoided responsibility and offered no clarity. For an HOA that once acted with swift punishment and rigid authority, this sudden retreat was impossible to ignore. This wasn't caution. This was fear. Behind closed doors, the board had discovered that enforcing the complaint against my lawn decorations would expose far more than a single violation. The deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the truth became. What started as a routine complaint had triggered a chain reaction. They could no longer stop. The records I requested arrived in pieces. Enforcement logs were incomplete. Some years were missing entirely. Fine records didn't always match bank deposits. Notices were issued without corresponding photos or documentation. Timelines varied wildly depending on the homeowner involved. And threaded through it all, like a recurring watermark, was Karen's name. Her complaints weren't rare. They were constant. She had filed more reports than anyone else in the neighborhood, often targeting the same handful of homes: new residents, renters, homeowners who decorated differently or declined to socialize with her. Many of the complaints resulted in immediate enforcement, while identical conditions elsewhere were ignored. What had once been dismissed as vigilance now looked unmistakably like selective enforcement. The HOA's legal counsel took over quietly. Language changed overnight. Emails were rewritten. Old statements were walked back. The property management company distanced itself from past decisions, framing them as misunderstandings or procedural errors. The board was advised to halt all enforcement actions pending review. That included mine. The decorations remained. Karen, however, did not remain calm. Her daily walks stopped. Her usual position at the edge of the neighborhood vanished. Curtains stayed drawn. When she did appear, it was brief and tense, her confidence replaced by agitation. She sensed the shift but didn't yet understand its cause. Meanwhile, neighbors began connecting dots. Connecting dots surfaced. Residents compared experiences. Stories that had once been shared quietly now found validation. Fines paid without explanation. Deadlines that contradicted written rules. Inspections that seemed to appear only after Karen passed by. The HOA's authority was unraveling. A special meeting was announced, framed as a routine governance update, but the agenda told a different story. Policy reviews, enforcement reforms, independent audits, new board elections. Karen's name wasn't on the agenda. It didn't need to be. The room was full. Residents who had never attended a meeting before showed up. Some brought folders. Some brought printed emails. Some came simply to witness what many had waited years to see. Accountability. Karen did not attend. Her absence was louder than any accusation. The HOA announced a freeze on fines and violations. Refunds were quietly processed. Notices were rescinded. The board acknowledged inconsistencies without admitting fault. It was damage control, not justice, but it was enough to confirm what everyone already knew. The problem was never decorations. The problem was power. Karen attempted to regain control the only way she knew how. She filed complaints of her own, alleging harassment and targeting. She contacted board members directly, demanding intervention. She framed herself as a victim of retaliation, insisting that she was being punished for caring about the neighborhood. But the timing betrayed her. The paper trail was too long, the patterns too clear. Her sudden shift from enforcer to victim raised more questions than sympathy. Every claim she made was weighed against years of documentation she had helped create, and the weight was crushing. The board stopped responding to her messages. The property management company redirected her inquiries to legal counsel. Her influence evaporated almost overnight. Then came the for sale sign. It appeared quietly one morning, planted in her yard like a confession. No announcement, no farewell, no attempt to save face. Just a house suddenly listed in a neighborhood she once controlled. Neighbors noticed immediately. Speculation followed, but no one needed to say it out loud. The woman who had weaponized the HOA had become its greatest liability. Staying meant scrutiny, accountability, and the collapse of the authorities she thrived on. So she left. The sale moved quickly. The house emptied faster than anyone expected. And just like that, Karen was gone. The HOA continued its slow transformation. Board members resigned. New elections were held. Policies were rewritten with clarity and fairness. Enforcement guidelines were standardized. Transparency replaced intimidation. The neighborhood breathed again. The decorations stayed up through it all. Untouched, unquestioned. They were no longer controversial. They were simply there. A quiet reminder of how fragile unchecked authority really is. Karen had believed the HOA was her shield. She never realized it could also be her mirror. By the time she understood, it was too late. And as the neighborhood moved forward without her, one thing became painfully clear: this was never about lawn decorations. It was about what happens when someone finally refuses to be afraid. The neighborhood did not change overnight, but the transformation was unmistakable. Where tension once lingered like humidity in the air, there was now space to breathe. Lawns were still trimmed and homes still cared for. Yet the fear that once governed every decision had quietly dissolved. The homeowners association remained in place, but it no longer ruled through intimidation. It existed, finally, as it had always claimed it would, as a steward rather than a tyrant. The absence of Karen was felt everywhere. Her house sold quickly, the for sale sign disappearing as silently as it had arrived. New owners moved in unaware of the role that property had played in reshaping the entire neighborhood. They decorated modestly, chatted freely, and waved without suspicion. No one warned them about enforcement or whispered about fines. For the first time in years, no one felt the need to. The HOA, forced into accountability, began its slow repair. New board members were elected under revised procedures that emphasized transparency. Meetings were announced clearly and minutes were published promptly. Enforcement guidelines were rewritten to remove ambiguity and eliminate discretion that could be abused. Complaints now required documentation, photographs, and clear references to specific bylaws. Anonymous accusations were no longer entertained. The association learned to fear one thing above all else: evidence. The audits that followed were uncomfortable but necessary. Years of inconsistent enforcement were documented. Improper fines were refunded. Notices that never should have been issued were formally withdrawn. While no public admissions of wrongdoing were made, the actions spoke louder than apologies ever could. Neighbors noticed. Attendance at HOA meetings increased. Residents asked questions. They read the bylaw. They shared information. The culture of quiet obedience was replaced with cautious participation. Authority was no longer something that existed above the myth, was something they understood. That's for my lawn decorations. They became almost invisible, not because they were removed, but because no one cared anymore. What had once been treated as a provocation was now just another expression of individuality. Seasonal changes came and went without comment. No notices appeared. No photos were taken. No complaints were filed. The system had learned its lesson. I was approached more than once by neighbors suggesting I run for the board. They believed my understanding of the rules and refusal to be intimidated made me an ideal candidate. I declined every time. Power had never been my goal. Accountability was. The HOA did not need me inside it. It needed to remember what happened when it overreached. The story of Karen faded into something between cautionary tale and quiet legend. New residents heard fragments of it, often sanitized and incomplete. The full truth wasn't necessary. The outcome was enough. The association knew now what unchecked authority could cost, and so did everyone else. What Karen never understood was that the HOA was never the strongest force in the neighborhood. Fear was, as long as people complied without question, the system could do whatever it wanted. But the moment someone stopped being afraid, truly stopped, the illusions shattered. Rules only work when they are followed by everyone, including those who enforce them. Karen believed rules existed to protect her dominance. She believed complaints were weapons. She believed authority was permanent. She was wrong. The HOA did not fear rebellious homeowners, it feared informed ones. By challenging a single notice, I had forced the entire structure to look at itself. By asking for documentation, I had exposed how little existed. By following the rules precisely, I had revealed how casually they had been ignored. That was the nightmare. Not chaos, not defiance, but clarity. Months later, the decorations came down as the season ended. They were replaced with something new, equally compliant and equally unremarkable. No one noticed, and that was exactly how it should have been. The neighborhood moved on, calmer and wiser, and somewhere far away, Karen lived in a place where her influence meant nothing, her complaints held no weight, and the rules no longer bent around her will. She had tried to use the HOA to control her world. Instead, she exposed how fragile that control truly was, and that was a lesson the neighborhood would never forget.